You know, what's interesting is that before this book came out, there wasn't a definitive history of fantasy sports. So when did you realize that there was a niche in the book marketplace that hadn't been filled?
Well, I played fantasy, for about 30 years or so. And, several years ago, I just kind of look at the industry and I think, I wonder, how did this all happen? People had ideas for games years ago, and then it evolved into this worldwide multi-billion-dollar industry with millions and millions of people playing all over the world. And you've got, stat services, news services, you got Sirius XM radio, 24/7 fantasy channel. Every time you watch a baseball or football game, getting fantasy statistics. So I just wondered, how did this all happen? Because no one has ever written a book about how it all happened. So I decided, I'm going to do it. It's needed. And I started out with the idea of just writing the history of, who did what, when, what happened. But when I started researching and interviewing people, I was hearing fascinating stories. And I realized what I wanted to do was write the stories of the people. So I kind of weave together the history with the stories of the people. And that has made it a really easy to read, fascinating book rather than it, coming off like a boring research paper about history.
And I want to get into the elements of the book, which, as you outline, as it's related to fantasy sports, it has become a multi-billion-dollar industry. But through your research, what have you deduced as the reasoning behind why people love fantasy as much as they do?
Well, it's just a great game that people love, and it brings people together. One thing that just kind of immediately became a common thread in my research and interviewing people is how it brings people together. You have people who started playing fantasy or, when they were in high school or college, and they're still playing with their friends 50 years later. You got parents and children who play together, co-workers play together. There was a fantasy football draft in Las Vegas where there's a plumber sitting next to the CEO of a Fortune 500 company, and the two of them are talking like they're best buddies. And one of the guys I interviewed for the book, I interviewed dozens and dozens of people. One of them was a guy named Mark Mariani who worked with CBS Sports and Turner Sports. He said when he first started working, his first job in the sports industry, he had never heard of fantasy football, but his office had a league. They invited him to join. They told him about it. And Mark said when he realized that if he joins this league, he could pick up the phone and call his boss's boss in the fancy office in Manhattan. This guy will take his call to talk about a trade or whatever. Whereas ordinarily, this guy wouldn't take his call in a million years.
And you have to be careful about the way you're trading with somebody that powerful. But it's a great example, right, of the way that fantasy connects people of different backgrounds. And your book chronicles just how far back fantasy sports go. And people might be surprised to hear and read that it goes back to the 1800s. So what did fantasy sports look like then?
Well, I wouldn't call that. I mean, whether you want to call that fantasy sports or not is debatable. You could say that was a precursor of fantasy sports. But in the 1800s, what you first had was like a tabletop game where you'd slide a penny into a spring-activated bat that would hit the penny, and there would be holes on the board. One might say single or home run or out. And then later on, you had board games like for baseball and football. Then you had like APA and Stratomatic. Now, APA and Stratomatic were really the first games based on statistics from real professional players in Major League Baseball, football, whatever. But the distinction is those were based on statistics from prior seasons. And what I refer to as kind of modern fantasy sports, the transition is fantasy sports that are based on events that have not occurred. So if you have a fantasy football league, you draft your team in August, and you don't know what's going to happen yet. The season, as the season unfolds, you're getting statistics as people play the actual game. So the distinction is, modern fantasy sports is based on statistics that haven't happened yet, games that haven't been played yet, and that started, kind of in the mid '50s is when the first kind of primitive versions of those games started.
How important was Stratomatic and rotisserie baseball to fantasy sports in general?
Stratomatic was incredibly important. I mean, so many people who play fantasy or who, became executives in Major League Baseball played Stratomatic. I had no idea what a big deal it was when I started researching the book. I thought, I'll probably write like 2 or 3 paragraphs about how Stratomatic and Apple were precursors to fantasy. But it turned out there's so much I couldn't believe it. And Keith Hernandez, for example, he's broadcast Mets games. When they play in American League cities, he'll use Stratomatic data even till today to help him broadcast the games, because Stratomatic has like ratings for like how good a throwing arm somebody has or how good a hit and run guy they are, a bunter. So he's not as familiar with the American League players, because he's more in the National League. So he'll use Stratomatic data to help him broadcast games.
You mentioned Keith Hernandez. He, of course, played in the 1980s. And you have an interesting story in the book about the Red Sox during the 1981 season as it's related to fantasy baseball. Can you tell us that story?
Yeah, and this involves Stratomatic yet again. In 1981, there was a Major League Baseball strike. And during the strike, some of the sports writers wrote about their fantasy baseball teams. This was like fantasy baseball, which actually was called rotisserie baseball then, was very new, but a lot of the sports writers and press boxes had their own rotisserie leagues. So during the strike, some of them would write about the rotisserie teams, and others would write about Stratomatic. And what happened, the Ken Coleman and John Miller decided to broadcast Stratomatic games because they couldn't broadcast Red Sox games. So during the strike, the Yankees were supposed to be playing the Red Sox, and what they did is they played a Stratomatic game between the Red Sox and Yankees, and they announced on the radio, I guess it must have been WEEI, wherever they were broadcasting Red Sox games. They said at the beginning, this is just a Stratomatic, recreation of a game. But of course, not everybody hears the disclaimer at the beginning, so people would tune in. They thought they were playing a real game. They were like using announcers and fake crowd noise, and it sounded like a real game. And people were calling like the Red Sox and saying like, "Hey, I'm a season ticket holder, and I'm outraged that you didn't notify me the strike is over."
I would have believed it. If I lived during that time, especially the Boston area listening in, I definitely would have believed that it was a real game. Now, when did the mainstream start to embrace fantasy to the point where it started to resemble something relatively close to what it looks like now?
Well, 1980, Dan Okrentz, the guy primarily credited with creating fantasy baseball, there were actually precursors before that, kind of primitive games. What he developed was kind of like, chess to everybody else's checkers. And that's when it really started to become known, because he was in the media. He was a writer, and the friends he got in his first league, they were all kind of in, magazine writers or editors or whatever. And because of this, they started to get publicity. Like there was an article in the New York Times, there's an article in Sports Illustrated. And so it got to be really well known. And that's how rotisserie baseball started to spread. It was because of him and his connections in the writing industry.
You hit on this a little bit earlier, Larry, but I think what draws a lot of people to fantasy sports is the communal feeling of it. And speaking personally, it's a way for me to stay in touch with friends from all walks of life. When you put this together, was there a specific story that really drew you in about the aspect of fantasy sports as it's related to the communal aspect that's a little bit different than the story you told a little bit earlier about the boss's 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 boss that was taking phone calls on behalf of the fantasy league?
Yeah, well, there's a lot of great stories in the book. I'll just pick one that came to mind, which is one of the first statistics services. When computers came around, people realized like, hey, we could use statistics for fantasy sports on a computer, whereas previously the commissioner of a league would have to spend hours and hours, every week computing it by hand. And one of the first statistics services for baseball and football was run by a couple, Jim and Gloria Berger in Pennsylvania. And what you had to do back then is for baseball, get the statistics for the American League on Tuesday from the USA Today and the National League on Wednesday. And Gloria would read them out, and Jim would enter them into the computer, and they, calculate the results, mail the reports to their clients on Wednesday night. One Wednesday, Gloria went into labor with her first child, and they didn't let that stop them from getting their job done. So in between contractions, she read the statistics from USA Today, and Jim would enter it into the computer. And then she'd feel, she'd be like, oh, wait, hold on. Another one's coming. Okay, it passed. And then she'd continue. So in between contractions, they got it done. They got the report out in the mail Wednesday night on time. And now here's the kicker, that, like, talking about the relationships and everything. Now, today, 37 years later, the daughter that was born that day plays with her father in a fantasy football league.
That's remarkable and such a beautiful story. I want to end with this, Larry. People in the fantasy world, they know that you're a prolific fantasy baseball player yourself, and you've written a whole book about it as well. For the folks that are tuning in, what is one tip that you'd like to give them about being good at fantasy baseball or just fantasy sports in general?
Do your homework, learn the rules of the league, spend some time evaluating players. Yeah. I mean, it's hard to give it, something really fast like that.
Yeah, no, and especially because you've written a whole book about it. So you've given, the lay of the land in terms of good tips about how to be good at fantasy baseball. Larry Schechter, the author of The History of Fantasy Sports. Thanks so much for the time.
Yeah.
Really appreciate you joining us.
Yeah, Joe, I just want to throw in, if, anybody listening to this that plays fantasy sports or knows somebody who plays fantasy sports, you'll love the book. It's a great gift. The holidays coming up. It's available most booksellers, paperback and ebook. If you go to Amazon, look for The History of Fantasy Sports by Larry Schechter. You'll see everything that's included in the book and the reviews. The reviews are fantastic. Yep.
And again, the full title of the book is The History of Fantasy Sports and the Stories of the People Who Made It Happen. Larry Schechter, again, thank you so much for the time. Appreciate you joining us.
Thank you.